This is video 6, and our topic now is ethnography, the method of cultural anthropologists. Ethnography has two phases. The first is the research, the field work, the going out and studying this culture from within. The second phase is turning that field work into work for an audience. And traditionally that has been a book. More and more today, an anthropologist might make an ethnographic film, a documentary, or publish a series of articles. But you'll be reading 3 ethnographies over the course of the semester. So we'll kind of take as our example of ethnography a book. I'd like to introduce you to Bronislaw Malinowski, a Polish-British anthropologist who is considered to be the father of ethnography because he sort of first made concrete the series of steps one has to take in the field to do ethnographic research. He wrote a famous book, famous in anthropological terms, of course, titled The Argonauts of the Western Pacific. You don't need to know that book title, but what you should know is that Malinowski was a proponent of a school of thought called functionalism that was very influential in the early 20th century through about the 1950s, and still has some influence, although there aren't really anthropologists today who would consider themselves to be functionalists. Just really quickly, the Trobriand Islands are somewhere in here. They're not pictured on this map. That's where Malinowski did a lot of his research. And so let me tell you about functionalism. It is a theoretical framework in cultural anthropology that studies each society as a system in which cultural beliefs, practices, rituals, everything else function to fulfill the needs of and keep order within that society. Functionalism really used that older definition of culture that I told you about a couple of videos ago. This notion that culture is like a bounded whole, and everyone within that culture and every practice in that culture is sort of working in harmony together. And the reason for culture, according to functionalists, was that they function to keep order within the society, to keep things going as they were before. So this picture of Malinowski and the Trobriand Islanders really says a lot about the role of the anthropologist in functionalism. So the idea in functionalism is that, well, here's a representative quote from Argonauts of the Western Pacific. Malinowski wrote, "Yet it must be remembered that what appears to us an extensive, complicated, and yet well-ordered institution is the outcome of ever so many doings and pursuits carried on by savages who have no laws or aims or characters definitely laid down." Let's stop for a moment. So, first of all, this extensive, complicated, and well-ordered institution he's talking about is something called the Kula, K-U-L-A, the economic system of the Trobriand Islanders. It's very interesting. It's like a little circle of islands, and as they're trading with each other, they're passing around these shell necklaces and shell armbands in clockwise and counterclockwise directions. And those items have no monetary value. They have more of a prestige value. They're gifts that the traders will give to each other that will make their way around over the course of several years around these islands. And as they're passing these necklaces and armbands around, they're trading lots of goods. And so he's saying here that there is this extensive, complicated, and institution that's the outcome of all these little doings and pursuits carried on by the Trobriand Islanders without no real law or aim or purpose. They don't understand why they're doing it particularly. They're just doing it. And by the way, he uses the term savages because he was a man of his time, and that was, unfortunately, the word applied to small-scale societies. He was not a social evolutionist, so he doesn't mean savages in terms of this evolutionary spectrum of savage to barbarian to civilization. Okay, so next, they have no knowledge of the total outline of any of their social structure. They know their own motives, know the purpose of individual actions, and the rules which apply to them. Okay, so individuals understand their own individual motives. But how, out of these, the whole collective institution shapes This is beyond their mental range. Not even the most intelligent native has any clear idea of the kula as a big organized social construction, still less of its sociological function and implications. All right, so a couple of notes here. First of all, when he's talking about the native mental range and intelligence, he doesn't mean that savages are less intelligent than anyone else. He's talking about anyone. When it comes to their own society, no one has the ability to pick out the big overall outline of why everyone is doing what they do. Again, they know their individual motives, but they can't explain, here's how X functions in this society, because they're too inured to it. They're within that system, and so they can't pull themselves out enough and get the bird's eye view to explain it. Okay, so if someone asked you something about your culture, about the big meaning and function of the entire culture, it would be very hard for you to answer that question. It's very hard for the Trobriand Islanders to answer that question. And so that's why an anthropologist is needed, because an anthropologist can go live with the people, watch them, observe them, participate in their lives, make notes, make analyses, and figure it out. Okay, so the anthropologist is this person, according to functionalists, who's kind of up on a pedestal and can see what the quote-unquote natives cannot. Okay, whoops. So that's functionalism. So get a sense of what that is like and the role of the anthropologist in that. And now let me tell you about a very different conception of the anthropologist and ethnographic fieldwork that came along a bit later in the 1950s and was very influential into the 1970s and has remained influential since then. So this is symbolic anthropology, and it's best exemplified in the work of, or earliest exemplified in the work of an anthropologist named Clifford Geertz, who pioneered a method that he called thick description. So Clifford Geertz worked in Bali, which is in the same part of the world, kind of. It's part of Indonesia right here. Okay, I got ahead of myself. First, let me come back to telling you what symbolic or what interpretive anthropology or symbolic anthropology is, and then I'll tell you about Geertz's fieldwork. So it's a theoretical framework within cultural anthropology that focuses on understanding and studying culture as a form of text, dialogue, and interpretation. So Clifford Geertz, working in Bali, observed cockfights. So he went along, he attended hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cockfights with his wife. And a cockfight is a big deal in rural Indonesia. So men in these villages get together and they fight with each other's cocks. And by the way, for Geertz, the word cock is double entendre, but not really, because everyone involved in this understands that men are fighting with roosters, but what they're really fighting for is their masculinity. So they have all of their masculinity identified with their cock. And by the way, here's an interesting note. Most people in the world call the male chicken a cock, but in the Victorian sensibilities of Britain and America, it came to be considered unseemly for the word cock to be used in everyday discussion, and particularly for a lady to say that word. So they came up with a new word, rooster, which makes no sense because all chickens roost, not just the male chicken. But it was a way to save these sensibilities in the Victorian era. But for Geertz and for the Balinese villagers, they're very clear that what they're fighting with is not chickens. They're fighting with their masculinity. Okay, so he attended hundreds and hundreds of these cockfights. And here's what he had to say about his method for understanding them. So what sets the cockfight apart from the ordinary course of life, lifts it from the realm of everyday practical affairs, and surrounds it with an aura of enlarged importance is not, as functionalists would have it, that it reinforces status discrimination. Such reinforcement is hardly necessary in a society where every act proclaims them, but that it provides a metasocial commentary upon the whole matter of assorting human beings into fixed hierarchical ranks and then organizing the major part of collective existence around that assortment, Here's the important part of this quote, okay? Its function, if you want to call it that, is interpretive. It is a Balinese reading of Balinese experience, a story they tell themselves about themselves. Okay, so the cockfight is a story. And who's telling the story? The individual Balinese involved. The anthropologist who's collecting these stories and then presenting them to an audience. And what happens here is the anthropologist is not this outside scientific observer, as Malinowski and the functionalists would have it. Instead, the anthropologist is studying culture as a kind of text. The anthropologist is reading a novel. And as we know, when we read a novel, I can have one interpretation, you can have one interpretation, someone else can have another interpretation. It's all interpretation. And all the anthropologist is doing is sharing interpretations. Okay? So this is symbolic or interpretive anthropology as compared with functionalism, and a very different view of the role of the anthropologist, either as scientific outside observer or in interpretive anthropology as interpreter of one of many possible interpretations.